Hi, I'm Steve McCord, Cattaraugus County Director of Veteran Services, and this is Our Veterans, Their Stories, preserving our heroes' stories, one story at a time.
I was walking down the jetway at Atlanta Hartsfield Airport to get on the flight to go to my sister's wedding back in Rhode Island, and heard people tell, hey, a plane crashed in New York. And I'm thinking, I've flown through New York City. I'm sure you might have too. And they fly right down the street. So I'm thinking a little prop plane hit a building. And then we're sitting down the plane. 20 minutes later, pilot comes on, hey, flights are canceled. There's been a crash. And we all walk off the plane. And then the second tower was coming down, like on the TV in Atlanta Airport right after we got off. Then, 6 hours later, I think I had my baggage, drove back down to Columbus, where I was living at the time, stationed at Fort Benning for the captain course. Then finally got a flight home to Rhode Island about 2 or 3 days later. Flew over, not over ground zero, but you can see it, smoldering as we flew up the East Coast. And then my sister's wedding, her then husband, I guess ex-husband now, they didn't make it to the wedding. He was stuck in Detroit. So we just essentially had a big family party, like in the front yard, which was kind of fun.
You flew over?
Yeah. But I mean, there were flights flying. I mean, they got the planes back in the air pretty quick. I mean, I know, of course, everything was grounded that day, but I remember, within 3 or 4 days, flights were going again and was headed back home. The line of traffic getting on Fort Bragg was like miles and miles long. She just parked the car, walked in. Fort Bragg, 82nd Airborne. I mean, they're, America's 911 force. I mean, something happens, they can have people moving in 18 hours. So, Fort Bragg was crazy. I mean, there were people getting ready to go, and initially it was going there and find and eliminate Osama bin Laden and the people working with him. And the Special Forces, Operation Forces went in there. Of course, we didn't get bin Laden until many years later, but they did a very good job of going in and eliminating key pockets of enemy fighters and leaders as they popped up. The main part of going after insurgent leaders was typically left to Special Operations Forces like SF teams, SEAL teams, Ranger elements going after them. And I was up in the northeast part when I went, and it's very much a lot like in western New York. You got a lot of hills, you got a lot of mountains, very woodland over there. I mean, a lot of people think Afghanistan is like a desert. I mean, parts of it are, but a big chunk of it's for the forest and timber industry is huge. If their timber smuggling was a big problem over there. Well, you get plenty of rocks, plenty of dirt, plenty of unimproved dirt roads, plenty of huge cliffs and whatnot. But it's very green, the eastern part. I mean, it's more or less untouched. Again, like I started the discussion, it's a huge country. You've got, very forested woodlands, you've got caves, you've got a desert, you don't have any real infrastructure to travel around the country. Believe it or not, back in the 50s, Afghanistan was an up-and-coming place. I mean, they had international airports going in, high culture, people travel there, and then that just kind of collapsed when the Russians came in. So you can go to Afghanistan whether you have the support there or not, and you're not going to get found if you don't want to get found. People say Taliban, Al-Qaeda, people say Shia, Sunni. Within each of those religious sects or different groups, there's like tons of different ideologies and subgroups, so it's kind of hard to characterize, just Taliban or just Al-Qaeda. But there are definitely elements within there that I'm sure fully supported bin Laden and what him and his people wanted to do. And I'm sure there's people who over there, they just want to run their country and they want to have the religious rule, and they're going to support their leaders because that's what followers do. I mean, in their mind, they had taken, after the Russians left, after their part of their phase of the war was over back in the 80s, the Taliban very quickly took over, established their form of a religious rule that they had there, and that's what they wanted. And I'm sure that there's elements that just want to cause destruction and kill people and wreak chaos. But the Taliban just wanted to run the country, and they saw us there as the impediment to it, and they just kept doing things along the way to, at some time they're going to leave. Let's go to the peace table, try to delay things a little bit. Hey, let's kind of distract the Americans so we can go do something someplace else. I've brought that comparison up, and from our perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot of small nuances in there. I mean, I can kind of get to the point where I sort of know the difference between Shia and Sunni, mostly from my time in Iraq, where that really came to play in a lot with essentially Iran culturally and traditionally owns the southeastern portion of Iraq. It's kind of more, it's almost a Persian-Arab dichotomy versus a purely Sunni Shia dichotomy. In Afghanistan, very similar, confusing tribal connections. I mean, in their mind, it's perfectly clear to them. I've made the comparison a couple times, a very uneducated comparison. It's almost like a Hatfield-McCoy's West Virginia environment. You've got families, they're all related, they know one another, but they'll battle each other one day and go to a wedding the next day.
So the concept of Taliban is a big brush, covering a whole lot of things that is too much of a generalization?
For the perspective of the discussions we have kind of here, it's fine. But when you're over there, I mean, obviously a lot more details, and you're working with the local person who knows this person or related to this person who's in this tribe who has affiliations with this network of insurgents who are kind of following our Taliban umbrella. There's an audiobook my wife and I started. We never finished it, but it was very good. It went from the history back in like the 1800s. And I think the rest of the book talks about that string where what we see now in Afghanistan had its roots back in the dynastic days, when Britain was meddling over there.
Mujahideen? I never knew what the exact term was. Was Mujahideen Taliban, or is that?
I think same thing. It's that's kind of the term that we use for. I mean, this could be way off the mark, but good Afghan fighters fighting Russians, Mujahideen. Yeah. Bad Afghans fighting Americans, Taliban. That's probably about as good a comparison as you're going to get. Now, in the Afghan army, interestingly, there are some of the Afghan army officers where they came up through the ranks and they worked for the Russians when the Russians were the occupying force. Then there was some Afghan officers who were Mujahideen fighters and were probably Taliban fighters at some point too, as it had a transition. And there were some just Afghan army officers who just were just regular Afghans who hadn't been affiliated with one side or the other back then. And again, they all kind of worked together, which was, they had their kind of going back and forth and stuff like that. You can look at our military and there's the same kind of internal politics and stuff that drives them together and drives them apart too. But it's interesting watching like how, you can tell the Afghan officers who were Mujahideen fighters before and the Afghan officers who worked with the Russians before. Just interesting, seeing them work together.
Were they Arabs? Were they nothing?
I know they were conquered by the Persians conquered that part of the world. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's really the mixing. It's a melting pot. You've got the northern part. You've got Tajiks from the Tajikistan area up there. You've definitely got the Persians, and there's some connections to Iran and Persia in the western part of the country, and Turkmenistan, that part of the world. Then you've got the Pashtun people in the east, which they're really their own people. That's a unique part of the country right there. And I think a lot of the problems are, when the Britain started drawing boundaries, split a lot of the Pashtun tribes. A bunch are in what became Pakistan, a bunch are in the eastern part of Afghanistan. Well, it really is a crossroads. I mean, I think Marco Polo's route traveled through there. A lot of the same roads that they used back then, they're still using now. And it's definitely, the mountain ranges divide the country. Got a pretty good range that runs kind of not quite bisecting north-south. And of course, the Himalayas are the northeastern part of the country. That's the part of the country I was up at. We look up the north and see like snow-packed mountains the whole year we're up there. To speak for Kunar province in the northeastern part, they had their own kind of personality, their own way of doing stuff. Of course, each province, back then had their own form of government. Or their own governmental district leadership and provincial leadership, but they were not quite like the United States, I guess. But they were individual. I mean, it's kind of the northeastern ones. It might have been more similar than the ones in the southeast or in the west. I mean, it's really the regions where really the big dividing parts were. Like you had Western Afghanistan, Northern Afghanistan, kind of northeast and east are kind of similar. But then, you start getting to the eastern part of Afghanistan, it kind of starts blending in with the central region. Well, the short, uneducated answer is it's all tribal, and whichever tribe has the most stuff and the most wasta, which is the Afghan word for street credit, that is who's going to make the rules. And that was always kind of superimposed upon whatever civil government the Russians imposed or, the central Afghan government kind of put together when we got there. But it was always tribal. I mean, that was always a driving factor.
So it's very local.
Yeah, yep, very local. In fact, it was so local. I mean, there's parts in Afghanistan where they don't know the Russians left and we came. I think they were part of the British India colony, and then when Britain started pulling out, the Pakistani region. We don't say it became autonomous, but that's when they came about their being. And at some point, when Britain finally established the borders for Afghanistan, the Pashtuns were always they had both Wasta. They were the fiercest warlords in the country. They gave them the biggest amount of trouble. So they will put a boundary, right through their tribal areas, and we're not going to have to worry about them as much. We'll let the people down to India worry about them.
How was the relationship with, one of the things you always heard about was the border with Pakistan, and sometimes, from John Tomerlin's point of view, sitting there watching the evening news, sometimes Pakistan was our best friends, and sometimes they were our worst enemy.
Well, part of it's based on obviously politics. The senior leaders in Pakistan and the United States would go back and forth about, we wanted Pakistan to give us access to something. Pakistan might have wanted something from us, and depending on how that went, they may be more supportive or less supportive. We'd always want the Pakistan army to go in and clear out the northwestern frontier province. That's the part that bordered the northeastern part of Afghanistan. And sometimes they'd send the army up there to clear out the insurgents. Sometimes they'd be less willing to go up there. Now the other part that came into play is every time there'd be some type of incident of some type of engagement along the border. Any army knows the weakest part is going to be in between units, whether you're trying to sneak in between the enemy lines, or if you're trying to sneak across the border, because it's generally ungoverned space. So the insurgents, they'd come across the border, they'd try to do stuff close to the border, we'd fire back. And whether it, cross the border or not is sometimes irrelevant, just the fact that something happened near the border. And it's kind of hard to prove kind of what happened. But no, in one case, I think, probably in a bunch of cases, we think we're engaging, insurgents, but in fact it ends up being a wedding party or some non-military target. And then that becomes a huge international incident, and that's an excuse for the Pakistans they've got to shut down their border because their people don't want to be they don't want their government supporting the U.S. I think it was in 2011 when I was over there. It might have been 2012. I mean, it was a pretty big cross-border incident where, I think it was a wedding party got blown up. And they shut down the Torkham Gate, which is really the Khyber Pass, that's really the main ground route for anything that we got in the country over there. They shut it down for a good long period of time, and we definitely saw the effects of it in the Northeast. Was less and less stuff in the dining facility. Fuel was harder to come by because we got a lot of fuel in by the ground route that way. And we made do, and obviously the soldiers did as well as they could up there. The getting from here to here in Afghanistan, it's not like physical terrain. It's really getting from here to here as far as ideas and how a country should run. And our mindset going in is we have this natural inclination. America is the greatest country on the planet. What we do works, so this is going to work in other places. And most people know that's not the case, but it's always in the back of everything we do.